Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Shop with Mentorship. I'm your host Medha, and in this series we have real, unfiltered conversations about career success, jobs, and work life. We, the people of India, the powerful words that not only set the tone of the Constitution of India, but guide the very principles of democracy, governance, and polity of an entire nation, and the fundamental rights of its 1.35 billion citizens. The onus on the legal system to hold the government accountable and uphold the fundamental rights of its citizens is extremely high. And if you're a constitutional lawyer like our guest on the show today, you're tasked with the onerous job of upholding the tenets on which this nation was built. A constitutional lawyer, Jahnavi is a graduate of the National Law School, Bangalore, and went on to pursue her master's in law from Yale. Jahnavi, interestingly, did not take on the regular route of leveraging her law degrees to land a job in a corporate law firm. Instead, she took the lesser traversed route of practicing, researching, and writing about constitutional law. She's a PhD candidate in Berlin and a visiting faculty at her alma mater, NLS Bangalore. Pleasure to have you on the show, Jahnavi. Welcome to Let's Talk Shop with Mentorship.
Thanks so much for having me, Medha. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. Likewise, Jahnavi. I have to ask you, you belong to a family of doctors and would have obviously grown up around that influence. How did law happen for you?
Yeah, I think it was the influence of doctors around that really had a strong part to play, with parents who very strongly believe in choosing a profession where, the idea was that even if you're not getting a job anywhere, you can just hold medical consultations in the street, and that the fact you can have legal consultations in the street. So just this idea that you will always be able to be self-employed and secure in that sense was an idea that I think I've always grown up with. Funnily enough, even though I belong to a family of doctors, I faint at the sight of blood. So medicine was never really an option for me. I think I just enjoyed whatever little I knew of law at the time, just the idea of arguing, especially for people who don't have the same kind of access as us. And I think to that extent, even my parents influenced me, because they both went to government hospitals at some point and a lot of pro bono work and continue to do so. So I think just the idea that you can be in a profession where you can be self-sufficient but also help others, it was always very interesting to me. Then I haven't really looked back since. I really enjoyed the trajectory I've taken.
So interesting. The space of law that you've actually chosen is where every other law derives from. The foundation of every procedural and substantive law in this country is actually the Constitution, right? But also what comes with that is a lot of responsibility, because the onus on constitutional lawyers like yourself to uphold the spirit in which the Constitution was drafted and refer back to that no matter what case you're picking on, the protection of fundamental rights being the central theme of it all is very, very high. Could you actually take us to point one and walk us through what constitutional law truly entails?
Right. So as you said, Medha, it's basically like this umbrella framework with respect to which all our laws operate, in that you have to judge the validity of every law that is passed or every executive action that is taken against the framework of the Constitution. So it's very interesting, because if you look at historically how nation states or states were built, the idea of a constitutional democracy came about very strongly after the Second World War. So if you look at, say, the framing of the American Constitution, the idea was, okay, you're moving from a colonial past and you want to have self-government, right? So the idea was that we will have democracy, and the only restraint on democracy will be the people itself.
Right.
Now that notion sort of changed after the Second World War, because that implicit trust that a democratic government will always act in the interests of the people, everyone got a reality check on that assumption after the Second World War.
Right.
Then you need to think of a framework where there are checks on the democratic government. And that's where constitutional law comes in. It's basically that check in the form of fundamental rights, where the idea is that the government must always account for your fundamental rights when making any law. And that's why it becomes such an umbrella framework that influences every law. Now, what's really interesting about this framework is that this framework is really vague. So if you look at Article 14, for instance, says that you will have the equal protection of laws or equality before law. Now, what does that mean? Like, how does that apply to a particular case?
Right.
That is where constitutional lawyers and judges come in.
Right.
And I find that inquiry is very, very interesting as opposed to other laws where, you are looking at, say, tax laws, where you look at classification of certain items, where your scope of inquiry would be limited to, say, previous cases, dictionary meanings, etc. In constitutional law, your scope of inquiry is very, very broad, where you're looking at history, like the framing of the constitution, what is it to come to mean in the Indian context. So, for instance, in India, equality is not merely formal equality, where everyone will be treated the same way.
Right.
In India, the historical background matters a lot more. Basically, if you belong to a community that has faced historical oppression, and that's called substantive equality. All of that, to get to those answers, you actually need to carry out a broad inquiry of the constitution, of the history of India, and also contemporary sociological issues and how these things are changing over time. So, for instance, if you had equality only in terms of, say, communities at one point, you're also now looking at equality in terms of economic class. How are those issues going to be navigated now with, say, concentration of wealth? So it's a very interesting nod to history as well as contemporary times. And the fact that you can maintain those connections and make those broad brush arguments while also staying true to the practice of law and the technicalities of it is what I find extremely interesting.
No, but it's actually very interesting the way you put this, because what I'm gauging from constitutional law as a sub practice is that unlike most of the other legal practices, the law in this case is ever evolving because it's evolving through the interpretations that different courts take. Constitutional law as a sub practice is, not entirely understood in terms of what the career opportunities are for you across, let's say, litigation, across what you can do in chamber practice. Is there an element of advisory that comes into play? And also, what are the revenue streams that open up for a constitutional lawyer?
If you want to, say, pursue constitutional law predominantly, you will be going for a litigation practice. Because most of these issues are litigated in court. And there, I think a lot of senior advocates especially have a very broad constitutional law base. And unfortunately, what happens in these situations is that a lot of constitutional law happens to be pro bono. What tends to happen if, say, a junior lawyer wants to start a constitutional law practice in, say, 5 to 7 years or maybe 10 years of you being a lawyer, I don't think you'll have an exclusively constitutional law practice. You will have a mix of commercial law, of civil law, which you will use to cross-subsidize your pro bono constitutional law practice. I think that's important to do as well, because constitutional law so many times will involve questions of constitutionality of these civil laws and these commercial laws. So it's very important to have that. And it's also interesting because if you have constitutional law come civil law practice, when the questions of constitutional law arise in corporate law and civil law, the people who are interested in challenging them will come to you.
Correct.
That's where, there's a lot of avenue for good earnings because those are the corporates that are challenging them. So, for instance, recently, the RBI about 2 years ago had banned Bitcoins through a circular.
Right.
And everyone challenged that. In terms of firm practice, I think there are a couple of firms that are now doing policy work. I think Amar Chand has a policy wing. There are now some interesting law firms that do a lot of policy work, like Ikigai.
Okay.
And these are all looking at constitutional law matters from the policy angle, which is where you're not actually waiting for the law to be passed and then you challenge it.
Okay.
But you're involved in the framing of the law through, say, certain parties. Ministries will call for comments, etc., or consultations. And you're involved in drafting those consultations. And that is especially really important in commercial areas such as data protection law. Those are areas where you can also join. In the same vein, there are also very interesting NGOs and organizations that are working on both litigation and the policy side of constitutional law. So I can think of the Internet Freedom Foundation, the Center for Policy Research, organizations that help on questions of land acquisition. In terms of advisory practice, that tends to happen at a much higher level, say if you're especially like a government lawyer, so panel counsel, and these are all litigating lawyers. So say at the post of a standing counsel for a particular government or a particular department, or even hire a solicitor general or an advocate general, you can give all of these advisory. What I personally have really liked that has changed from, say, say 7 years ago about the practice is that earlier, if you wanted to practice constitutional law, you would inevitably join a senior's chamber. Your job would be limited to research, whereas the senior would be the one doing the arguing. That has changed a lot. There are a lot of junior counsels doing a lot of constitutional law practice. So you may not be arguing the heavy duty constitutional law matters that you think, you always see in the papers. But you will be going to, say, the Delhi High Court or any other high court and arguing simple writs, which actually really impact that one person who has to file them. And the benefit of that is that you're arguing interesting questions of law and you're likely to see results faster and more tangible results for that individual that you were filed for. And then there's also academia, obviously.
Right.
There's a lot of scope for constitutional law.
And the academia aspect also is integrally linked with the research one's doing in an advisory practice.
Yes.
Right. When you look at subspecializations in other areas, it doesn't offer you such a plethora of options. There's some bit of advisory, but it's primarily chamber practice or litigative in nature. Like you pointed out, have a plethora of options that open up, and more often than not, a constitutional lawyer will have to cherry pick things to sustain a career. Jahnavi, you did the dream combination, right? You did NLS Bangalore, which is a dream to get in, and Yale Law again is aspirational for so many. You did the best of both worlds. I want to take you back to campus life. How diverse were both those experiences for you? And more importantly, how do you think either has shaped the lawyer you are today? Because I know both these experiences would have been fairly different in nature for you.
Yeah, so I think NLS was most importantly a very good learning experience, I would say, because you're also just spending time growing up. 5-year-long program. It's half a decade of your life that you spend in this campus removed from the city. I would describe it as extremely rigorous. I see the importance of that. Just the fact that you have to submit 4 projects every 3 months, 8 sets of exams. I think that really prepares you for the real world where there is no break, right? Where you're always working. I think it also gave us a strong base in every subject. So you didn't have to go floundering to figure out what is a contract and what happens in family law. And there are times when you can still go back to those ideas that you have learned. And I think what's very interesting about my NLS experience, and I think that this applies to a lot of law schools now, is that you're not just coming out as a lawyer, you're also just coming out as a person with just important analytical skills. So a lot of people who go to, say, a law school very often don't end up doing law. They end up in investment banking, end up in, say, the consulting firms. A lot of them work for startups, or they're also preparing for the UPSC. So I would say in my batch, it was very, very diverse and people did very different things. And what I also learned personally a lot from were the extracurriculars. So for instance, moving and debating and all of those opportunities that law school gives you. I think it's very important to have that holistic experience in law school. I think one very distinct thing about NLS and Yale was that NLS was very, very competitive. And I don't think it has to be. So, I mean, because this podcast is meant for students who might be aspiring to get into a good law school, I also want to stress on the fact that, it's very important to not get lost in that competition because it's also your college experience, right? So you have to come out with long, life-lasting friends. And if students are ready to commit to law, then I would say that it does make sense to work really hard for the entrance examination to secure a good law school if you can. It does make things easier, right? Because when you go to an established law school, they have established frameworks or paths that you can follow. I think it also, at the same time, gives you the courage to find your own path as well. Say in 11th, 12th grade, if you're serious, commit to law coaching, think about the CLAT seriously, spend some time on it, especially after the board exams when there's that temptation to, sit and relax. Work hard so that you can give that exam in May and feel happy about the way you've done it. In terms of Yale, I worked for 2 years and then decided to go for my master's. So I knew exactly what I wanted to study. As opposed to NLS where you're studying everything, here I was just studying constitutional law. Yale, I think, also has a very strong influence on constitutional law. So a lot of people that scholars we cite in India as well are from Yale or have been to Yale. So there was only 24 people in the LLM. It became a pretty close-knit family because you're away from home. Academically speaking, the library, the research, just absolutely fantastic. I found old books in Indian constitutional law that have not been signed in India available there. So
fantastic.
And I think the good thing about Yale is that it also has a lot of financial aid. So for students who may not want to spend that much or take a loan for a master's, excellent place to go to.
Jahnavi, you touched upon the competitiveness of profession, and it obviously starts at the get-go when you're preparing for your CLAT. You correctly pointed out the benefits top brand of law schools offer to students in terms of future opportunities or in terms of building an all-round personality and prepping you for the profession. But let's say you didn't get into the top rung of law schools in this country. Then what? What are the options for someone who hasn't made it into one of these top brands? How can they pivot and how can they cover up for what a second rung or a third rung law school may not be able to offer to them?
So I think that's a really important question, Medha, and thanks for asking that. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that if you've not gotten into a top rung law school, it's not the end of the world. There are two routes that you can take. The first is you go to the law school you got into. The difference between, say, my time in law school and students who are listening to this podcast is just the information that is now available beyond your law school. So, you have these websites called Live Law and Bar and Bench, which give you hourly updates of whatever is happening in the legal world, right? So the effort that we had to make to find out about cases that were new and what's happened, you don't have to do that anymore.
Right.
There are these amazing legal academic blogs on constitutional law, criminal law, civil law, all of which you can follow to be completely updated with the happenings of the legal world. And legal internships is the best way for you to get a placement. So you can start in third year like everyone else does and pursue lawyers or firms that you're interested in. Eventually secure that placement. And here you don't need to do anything extra. Most lawyers are just looking for dedication and interest, and that's all that you have to showcase. It is not, you're not supposed to show that you're the smartest person who knows everything. No one expects you to know everything. Just the fact that you're dedicated enough to do that research and find out the answers. When we hear about how internships are actually just about contacts, but actually there are several lawyers now who are making an effort to go beyond that network that they know. And I can also say this for several Supreme Court judges who have an open system where you apply. In fact, the Supreme Court also has an open system where you write an exam and then you clear the exam, and the exam is fairly simple. And you clear that and you be assigned to any judge. If you feel that you have not gotten into a great 5-year law school, you can always do an undergraduate degree and then go for a 3-year law school. I think it's definitely adds to you to do, say, a humanities course or say economics honors or political science honors. It really adds to your knowledge, a base that you will require, and then move on to law school. So now there's several 3-year programs. So LawFac is the most famous one.
Even GLC, Government Law College, Bombay.
GLC has one. NLS is just starting one. There are several options for us, and we always tend to think, oh, let's just go to the best top 5 law schools. But I personally taught in other law schools and I have seen great talent there. So I don't think anyone should feel that because they did not do well on that one day of CLAT, should define the course of the rest of their career.
Those lines are so powerful because unfortunately you could have worked really hard, but you could have just been having a bad day unfortunately on the day of that entrance. And your entire life course should not be chalked out basis those 3 hours of an exam. The former Attorney General Soli Sarabji once said that lawyers don't retire, they practice till they die. It's an ongoing process of studying the law because the law is ever evolving, especially the space that you're in. Hence the driving factor behind choosing one specialization becomes really critical, right? Where did you find your driving factor behind choosing constitutional law?
Yeah, I think it evolved over time for me. I think what I really enjoyed was this entire idea of how courts get the legitimacy to overrule an elected government. And, I was actually exploring that more in another area of law, arbitration, where there was this entire thing about should courts even interfere with arbitral tribunals, which is slightly different, but also similar about legitimacy of courts. And I found that very, very interesting. And that obviously becomes even more interesting in the context of constitutional law, because the question there is like, how do you decide what equality means for society? How do you decide who has rights and all of those questions? The interest in constitutional law is sort of, rekindled, so to say, when you have these special seminars, like these specialized seminars in 5th year, where you're doing courses from practitioners and academics who are not full-time professors, but then they just come and teach you specific sort of super specialized courses. So I had 3 courses on constitutional law that really helped me, revive that interest. And for me, I think it's just that broad scope of inquiry that you have, where you're turning to history, political science, sociology, and just contemporary issues as well, along with questions of constitutional interpretation, which is more legal technicalities. And you're weaving all of that together and making that argument. And the fact that you're making that argument for very important, pressing issues that actually can make a difference in someone's life.
Jahnavi, we spoke of how laws evolved very specific to the spirit in which the country was conceived, right? Across the socio-cultural, economical and political aspects of how a country comes together. How does studying law abroad, specifically constitutional law in this case, fit into the Indian scheme of things? How does it help you when you come to practice in India?
Right. So that's a very important question. And I think different people will answer it differently. My answer is that one, when you go do a master's, a lot of times you're looking at first principles. So for instance, you're looking at theories of rights. So it's very easy to transpose that, especially from the US to India, because one, they're both common law countries. So the same system of, say, precedent, how laws are interpreted, etc. And the other thing is that we actually borrowed a lot of constitutional concepts from the US. So it's very funny. We actually, sitting in 2022, are still citing case law of the US from the 19th and 20th century. And interestingly, my entire research project is challenging this idea of the way we sort of blindly import case law from the US without recognizing that there is actually a difference in our systems. So it actually worked out really well for me. But I think generally, because you're going to another system, you will be expected to know that system. So that is that extra homework that we need to do. But you will come away with all of these first principle theories and knowledge that is helpful.
Yeah, and the adaptation of that to the Indian context is an interesting aspect to explore. And Jahnavi, you spoke of how in India, unlike other nations, the scope of judicial interpretation, especially in recent times, has widened extensively. And that finds testament in the fact that there have been landmark judgments in recent times by the Supreme Court and High Courts that have substantively explored constitutional matters. From judgments exploring the scope of right to privacy to right to freedom of religion. These judgments are basically laying the foundation of what governance, freedom, and basic human rights in this country are going to look like. What, in your opinion, is that one ruling of recent times that holds the potential to alter the course of democracy in this country?
For me, it really was the right to privacy judgment. It's very interesting for me that the government actually argued that there is no right to privacy in 2018. And you look around everywhere in the world where everyone has either constitutions that were drafted after the Indian Constitution where this right is expressly recognized, or you have cases in the 60s, 70s that have settled this position. Nowhere else in the world is someone arguing that there is no right to privacy. Personally, for me, I thought that was a very interesting case because there the court is effectively saying, look, the right to privacy is not expressed in our constitution, but it is implied. And the reason it is implied is because privacy is effectively necessary to protect all other rights, because you need to have this space which is free from state interference to develop your autonomy, where you have this space where you have freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of sexual orientation, and that is all linked to your idea of autonomy. Do I have the autonomy to marry someone outside my religion or caste? Do I have the autonomy to express my sexual orientation? And the idea of autonomy also really defines state action. So, for instance, if the state is doing something, it just interferes with your idea of autonomy and your idea of, say, not being bothered with some paperwork, right? The burden is on that state, the state, to explain why are they interfering with that autonomy. And that is such an important foundational principle of constitutional law that I feel gets lost in India. That I think the fact 9 judges of the court sat together and said, look, privacy is important to protect autonomy and there's this right to autonomy. That I think will take us very far. So just like all of these laws that have come up for interreligious marriages, maybe, the idea of uniforms in school and whether you can wear religious symbols, All of these are very crucial questions of autonomy that will now have to be answered.
For the benefit of our listeners, Jahnavi's work extensively on the right to privacy linked matters. In fact, she's written a fantastic piece on the Pegasus order that covers the right to privacy and how judicial interpretation has advanced in scope to actually incorporate right to privacy and its finer nuances. Anybody who's looking to know more about the Pegasus order and finer nuances of it, Jahnavi's done a fantastic piece in the Quint. I'm going to link it to this podcast for the reference of our listeners. On ground, the legal profession is facing this huge vacuum in terms of the number of litigating lawyers that are needed and the number we have on ground. And you often find, members of the bar and bench criticizing this whole corporatization of the legal profession, which is a trend essentially where now you find most law students who've passed out from top law schools eventually joining corporate law firms. Resultantly, obviously, the number of litigating lawyers on ground has consistently dipped over the years, adding to this huge burden on courts. Pro bono, in a way, has tried to bridge the gap, but obviously the ask is very, very huge. You went the other way and chose a field of law where litigating is such an essential aspect. How do you think India can solve this gap and get more lawyers interested in litigation?
I think the biggest problem, honestly, is money. There is such a difference in the kind of pay that you will receive in a corporate law firm versus a litigating chamber practice. And honestly, there is no reason for this pay gap to exist. There are several lawyers who are doing extremely well, but may not pass on that to their juniors. One encouraging sign that I see is that that's sort of changing now with generations who have worked as those juniors who have not earned too much and now are doing well, and they want to pass that on. Junior lawyers are talking about this more, so there is this understanding that we will discuss pay scales.
I remember reading a piece by the iconic Justice Ruth Ginsburg of the US Supreme Court, who commented on how a lawyer can derive true satisfaction from the profession only and only when they stop seeing themselves as mere fee-charging artisans, but as contributors to the public good, which instantly connects to the lack of institutionalized pro bono as a culture in our country, unlike the West. If anybody's seen Suits, they know how integral pro bono is for legal firms in the West. For the longest time, NGOs have actually taken that burden, picking up a lot of the cases that are pending in our court. Could you share your thoughts on this and the efforts being done to tackle these mounting cases in the lower courts?
I can only speak for the Delhi courts because that's where I practice. There is actually an important push to be impaneled as amicus or as legal aid lawyers. And I think people do take advantage of that. And I would stress that younger lawyers should definitely do it, even if this is something you're not getting a lot of money out of. It's really just an absolute privilege to be able to help someone. And I think the best thing to do is to charge your corporate clients as much as you can and then do pro bono work because it is, you can manage. But I think, of course, firms are, there's just so much, the lack of will there to actually do pro bono work. And also because so many firms have such a different structure in India compared to the US, where firms don't always go to court. Transactional work in India. So I think those are barriers that always also come in. But that's not to say that this can't be changed. The court can definitely create incentives,
Right.
Like just simple things like, you have law firm rankings. You could also have like a pro bono law firm ranking, who's doing the best pro bono work.
I think necessitating X number of pro bono cases in a year, depending on the size of an individual's practice or a firm's practice, could be something that could be actioned. Do you think that will be well received?
It can definitely be actioned in terms of firms because you have an idea of their capacity and resources, but you may not know about individuals. And therefore, I think it's definitely something that can be considered for firms and could be pushed through the whole corporate social responsibility route. Of course, there will be pushback, but I think eventually people will come around to it and we will see some results, if not, the best results that we're hoping for.
On a more generic note, what do you think your top tips would be to a legal aspirant in terms of the qualities and the interests they need to hone before considering law as a profession?
The law is a profession where you just need to read a lot and have a lot of background knowledge, which is very important, especially in the humanities, even technology, all of these issues, right? So I think to be a good lawyer, there's no escaping that. It is a very people-heavy profession. So you're dealing with clients, you're dealing with judges, or both of whom you have to navigate. So I think if you have that interest of interacting with people, I would recommend it. But if you don't, you can easily go into transactional work. You should be prepared that it is a lot of hard work. Like everyone gets their weekends, but in law you don't because you have to prepare for a Monday matter on a Sundays.
Like you pointed out, out, in recent times, the legal system is seeing a paradigm shift, not just in process, but also in the lens that's being adopted by our courts while interpreting the law. So it's an exciting time to be a part of this profession. And I know countless law aspirants listening to this podcast who are going to want to explore constitutional law. And this is going to be their reference point to doing that. Jahnavi, it's been an absolute pleasure connecting with you and exploring nuances of constitutional law as a profession.
Thanks so much, Nida. It was a pleasure chatting with you. And also, it helped me reinforce my commitment to what I'm doing and, thinking about why I made these choices. So it was a great trip down memory lane for me.
I'm so glad, Jahnavi. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thank you so much for your time. Jahnavi Sindhu offers mentoring hours on our platform, Mentorship. If you're looking to build a career as a lawyer or are wanting to know more about constitutional law as a specialization, book your time with her today.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Let's Talk Shop.